when I started teaching at Stanford Law School decades ago, I was what was euphemistically called a generalist, which means I didn't really have, I had an academic background, but I hadn't developed much of a practice background in any field in particular. Okay. And at the time, the law school here had a need for somebody to teach commercial law, not the bankruptcy course, but some species of a uniform commercial code course. And I did that for a while. A lot of the emphasis was Article 2, but that's not really very interesting because Article 2 is just a reliving of contracts in some ways. And it was obvious that the more interesting subject was Article 9. So without any practice background at all, and I really mean I had none, I worked up the Article 9 course. And as you know better than I, the UCC, even though it's about people in business largely, it's something of a, it's a very doctrinal phenomenon. It almost purports to be a self-enclosed, codification. And therefore, if you're half decent at doing legal doctrine, you can do it without really knowing, what factors do, when they deal with accounts receivable down in Jaime's Shoe Mart or something like that.
Right.
So I worked up Article 9 and I actually enjoyed teaching it for quite a while. And then I shifted entirely over to criminal law, in which I had a separate background. When I was teaching Article 9, I was doing some of the 547 stuff. And there's obviously a bit of an overlap, well, fair amount of overlap with bankruptcy, but I never taught the bankruptcy course itself. The main bankruptcy teacher here then was one of the great scholars of the field, Professor Thomas Jackson.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Who was my good friend. And went on to do other things. He became a dean and a provost and university president. But his earlier articles about the nature of bankruptcy law were obviously just of existential significance at the time. One day, Tom showed me an obscure little case, which became my article. Namely, it was the Rittervold case from the crusty old Judge Friendly, and it shows up at the end of the article. But it all started when Tom suggested, if you're interested in getting a little into bankruptcy, why don't you write a little article about the Friendly opinion in Rittervold? And I started thinking, all right, I'll just write a kind of case note. And then I just got curious about background stuff, and you'll see there that I'm not a legal historian either, but I was a bit of a self-taught legal historian and got a lot of help from the library in reading all this background stuff. So in some ways, as much detail as I go into about modern bankruptcy and the history of bankruptcy law, my interest in it was probably at a sort of more abstracted level about rules, standards, formalities, morality and law, and so on and so on. So that's how the whole thing happened. And I haven't written anything in the area of commercial law bankruptcy since. So yeah, I started teaching criminal law at the time. Ironically, I did 2 big papers in order to get tenure at the time. You got to get tenure. One was this paper, and the other, oddly enough, was an article on the death penalty. And they're both, in fact, some friends of mine said, you're always writing about the same thing. You're always writing about rules versus standards. And, the big debate as the death penalty, the constitutional law of the death penalty emerged in the 70s and 80s was, were we going to correct for the old problems of the death penalty by having very clear rules and elements of crimes, or were we going to revert to pretty open, even subjective standards? So there was a funny kind of synergy there. I should explain, though, that my real background was not in law at all. I had a previous career teaching college English, literary background. So that's what, in a way, got me. So 2 things that got me interested in the legal history of the preference was, first of all, what you might call the characterology of various figures in the law merchant. And in other words, there's a kind of cultural / literary aspect to the thing. But second of all, how, punishment, sort of played a role, but was denied. Myth may be the wrong term. I think at some point I used the term Whiggish history. But I guess my view, and I don't think it's particularly profound, is that, anytime you're dealing with a morally fraught area of human life or commerce, and obviously criminal violence is more morally fraught than bankruptcy, but obviously there are ethical and moral questions in bankruptcy. And this may be where the term unstable came in, and it may have been the wrong term. Efforts to contain things in formal rules will always, I'm not going to say they're going to fail, but they'll always be challenged because they're trying to, put a cap on a pressure cooker, and things just come out in different ways. And it just struck me that from a very broad perspective, there was this purported shift towards morally neutral, technical rules, and that there were interesting eruptions along the way and resistance to technical rules. And the crusty old Judge Friendly example, I thought was, well, this is what Tom told me, was just a very good example of it. I haven't kept up with bankruptcy law at all. I guess I find it interesting, maybe even flattering if the article has some continuing significance. But I guess it's part of my broader view that cultural norms and moral values will always enter into the legal arena, even when there is the purportedly scientific effort to cabin them. The very term preference suggests, an attitude on the part of the debtor to favor certain people. It could simply suggest emotional relationships. It could, of course, suggest corruption of some kind. And yes, it's to be distinguished from fraudulent transfers, but I think in some ways that separation wasn't as clear as the law purported to make it, and so on and so on. I also think despite the kind of denatured view of bankruptcy that we now have, certainly with individual bankruptcy, it carries with it a certain stigma. And although I never did anything with corporate reorganizations, obviously there were concerns about ethical behavior of corporations. There were obviously some morally fraught issues in bankruptcy, which I know nothing about, like labor unions, as unsecured, workers as unsecured creditors or whatever. So I'm giving you a mushy answer, which is the best I can do right now, but I just always thought that preferences were an interesting example of a legal phenomenon that had, I think, a moralistic basis to it, morphed into something else, but very incompletely. I can't answer that because that would require me to announce something very pseudo-profound about the purpose of bankruptcy law, okay? And should it include, controlling bad behavior? So I viewed myself as simply a describer of the tensions, not as taking any position on it. I'll mention something which is sort of about business and an area I know a little more about than bankruptcy, and it's related to my criminal stuff. And just to get at your reference to the phrase ordinary course of business, that's supposed to be legally and almost sort of sociologically a pretty neutral term. It's as if it could be determined empirically, but of course, there are norms about what's the ordinary course. Or at least, if you think of Llewellyn and the commercial code, it was based on an assumption that there is rational but ethical behavior by merchants. There were so many parts of the UCC, more in Article 2 about customs and usages of merchanthood and all that. So they were almost like stipulated to be fair ways of doing things, okay? An ordinary course is a way in a lot of areas of law of finding some objective criterion by which we can say no bad behavior was implicated here. It just sort of happens in the ordinary course. So the other area I was going to mention is I teach a course in white collar crime, and in the area of insider trading. One of the defenses to insider trading, where an officer or director of a corporation seems to be doing a lot of selling or buying of his own stock, is, well, I wasn't really making any decision. Yes, it so happened that either the sale or the purchase benefited me during a period when I had inside information, but I can show you that early on, we had set up a very formal scheme. I don't, I have my stockbroker do it and all that, and it just sort of happens this way. And sometimes those are questionable claims and all that. So just to say that, number one, finding a firm line about what is ordinary course and is not ordinary course itself might have some normative implications. Ordinary also means kind of reasonable, okay? But also there are ways of manipulating the ordinary course in some ways. So maybe that's of some relevance here. I think legal systems not only do, but should have safety valves. I realize there's the term safe harbor, maybe even the term safety valve in some legal regimes, but I'm using it a little more loosely because legislation is always very general. It should be general, otherwise it's not legislation. But I think there has to be a kind of concession to human or legislative frailty sometimes. So think of in criminal law where, you're convicted of a crime, but most, not all, but most criminal punishment laws will leave some discretion in the judge, whereby the judge, the death penalty is the hugest example of this, but even in more conventional prison sentencing, there's some discretion whereby the judge will actually hear evidence, and even the term evidence is a little loose, that was inadmissible at trial. Most obviously in a pre-sentencing report, there's going to be a kind of biography of the defendant, which will include, character evidence, background evidence, whatever, which was irrelevant to trial, but has to come in terms of sentencing. So I think if some formal acknowledgement of an equitable power to do things like that is probably a good idea, because it's almost like an argument for transparency, because judges could find ways of sneaking in equity anyway, but would wind up doing it the wrong way, finding that the rules haven't, coming up with a legalistic rationalization for it, like this didn't meet whatever the legal requirements are for establishing a clawback, just in the technical sense. So I think there are times when either the legislature itself has been too arrogant, or judges take an overly arrogant view of the legislation, as if it has solved all problems and therefore leaves no room for equity, or there's such a belief in a kind of a really hyperbolic belief in the necessity of pure neutrality, that no safety valve is left. And again, number one, it should be left. Number two, it may happen anyway. Let's try to, well, indeed, control it a little, not in a highly regulatory way, but, something like if the judge wants to do a departure, that's actually, a term from sentencing law, on some kind of equitable ground, there should be a stated rationale for it, reviewable on appeal only on an abuse of discretion standard, I suspect. But I think that some legal goals are met by having something like that on the record. That's the best I can do. I don't know, maybe it was the idea was that, maybe we should have, a purely technical rule, but just so bluntly clear, and somehow behavior would adjust, maybe that. But that the preference law, looked at historically, was a somewhat incoherent, mixture of things. And so maybe that was kind of a rhetorical point. Again, by bizarre analogy, when the death penalty laws were being revised for constitutional reasons in the early 70s, the problem was always that the old death penalty laws, the ones that were in existence for 100 years in the United States, I mean, the way they worked is this: you're convicted of a crime, usually murder, but not only, not just murder. The jury goes to the jury room, decides whether you're guilty. And if they decide you're guilty of murder, they right there decide based on the limited information they have and subject to all the prejudices they have, whether you should live or die. Okay. This is so-called unguided discretion. What they came up with in modern death penalty law is guided discretion with sort of rules and things like that. Some of the states, in response to the 1970 ruling, the Furman case that illegalized all those old unguided discretion laws, some states perfectly logically eliminated all discretion. They identified especially aggravated forms of murder, like killing a police officer in the course of his duties, and made the death penalty automatic for that. See, solved the problem, no discretion. Well, that didn't sit well. So maybe I was making a rhetorical point. The court, look, was of several minds. It said, on the one hand, yes, we want more rule-like regulation, because otherwise things are either capricious or racist or both. But when it comes to something as serious as criminal sentencing, there has to be some individualization. Now, the argument for individualization is obviously going to be greater there than in the bankruptcy context. But maybe I meant it as a rhetorical point to say, well, I admit we could solve the problem this way, because if I think preference law is sort of an incoherent mixture of things, let's unmix it one way or the other. But I think my pardon the expression, my preference would be along the lines you and I have just been talking about, that more transparent legitimation of some safety valves. That's where I would end up.